Life and death, it's all a dance. Talking love and giving chance. Laughs and tears, we're here to share. Join us now, we're always there.
Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that today's episode covers sexual assault. This is a deeply sensitive topic, and we encourage you to listen in a way that prioritizes your well-being. If you need to step away, take a break, or seek support, please do so. Resources for survivors will be shared in the information for this episode. Hi, Genna.
Hello, Noelle. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I am good.
Genna, we are doing a two-part episode series today and also today. And so why don't we just explain a little bit about what today's episode is going to entail
Absolutely.
and go from there.
So today we're going to have a conversation with Will, who is the Director of Education at PAAR, which is Pittsburgh Action Against Rape. And this is kind of along the lines of our April episodes, with it being Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And Will is going to give us some insight into more than just the rape part of it, and how he's going to expand on what PAR does as far as the education, and that it's limitless as far as ages to work with. And I think it'll be very informative for people so that they can recognize that sexual assault is not just rape. There's a lot more to it.
Yes, I think it will be a very good conversation. And thank you, Genna, for organizing these two guests that we are having, because you've done all the legwork. I've just been over here in England waiting for you to make it happen. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say PAR is a fantastic organization that has offered me support, as well as support to many, many of my clients when I was working with within the foster system. And even now I use them as a resource in my coaching. I really appreciate them. And this is also to be said that there are organizations out there everywhere. And we will link ways to get in touch with local organizations where you are, because obviously it's not just in Pittsburgh. And as always, I am here for whoever needs to reach out, and if you need support in this. Hey, so hi, Will. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It's not doing too bad. Yeah,
That's a very solid, honest answer.
yeah. Ups and downs, like universal healthcare.
Exactly.
Yeah, like there's pros and cons in my life right now.
I hear
Ah,
you, but there's at least there's some pros. That's what we'll go with.
I love it. Yeah,
Always look
for
at the
sure.
positive.
For sure. Yeah,
So, would you like to tell us a bit about what you do at PAR?
yeah. So at PAR, I am the director of education, which means that I lead and manage a small team of educators who work within the Allegheny County system. So we provide training, professional development, and programs to educational systems, the community, and really anybody who sort of wants to think about some awareness, prevention, or education around sexual violence. And that doesn't have to necessarily mean assault. It also means harassment, thinking about gender equality, thinking about really the building blocks that often sustain rape culture and often sustain like normalization of sexual violence. So that's what my team does. Everything from K through 12 schools to some colleges to communities to working with parents and businesses as well. So we do a lot of things. I have a small but mighty team, and I'm extremely grateful for their expertise and their willingness to work on bizarre hours. So for sure, yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
always. So I have a question. I
Yeah.
very big on speaking of consent with
Mhm.
my coaching and with my sex education.
Yeah.
Um, could you give us a bit of information about where that begins in the school system? I know, like for myself, when I bring up I'm a sex educator,
Mhm.
people can sometimes go straight to like the sex part of the
Yeah.
educator rather than the actual like consent part and the
Mhm.
words. So that's what I'd like you to kind of expand on, what you
Yeah.
guys do there, to start that conversation.
Yeah. You know, much like I think a lot of people who come into spaces, especially in the K through 12 school setting, I think people have a sort of an idea what you're going to talk about. And I think often, especially our name, right? I work in a space, so with the name, there is, rape in the name. So I think often that is a difficulty for us to get in spaces. But I think when we're talking about consent, especially in elementary and K through sort of the younger years, really we're talking about it from a a sort of conversation around boundaries, a conversation of who we are, some autonomy, but also really what it means to be in a relationship with society, with people. And I don't mean relationship in a sexual or romantic way. I mean like, everybody has relational sort of experience. So often our educators are really just sort of bridging that gap. We're sort of bridging the fact that there is the me that they identify, and then there's the others, and really how we sort of um, allow for that conversation to think about what their needs are, what they want to happen, and then really what others want to happen. So often our conversation has nothing to do with sex or relationships, out like romantic relationships, outside of the we're all in relation with each other, and how do we navigate that in a safe way that makes sure like we feel safe, but then other people feel safe. So that's often where we start, and that's often in a lot of spaces that's where we end. That bleeds into some conversations around boundaries, and then depending on where we're at and really what sort of age appropriate at the time, we blend into harassment or bullying as well, and thinking about what does it mean to harass somebody or to bully, depending on our language, and really depending on the school or the space, because we try to adopt the same language, because we know that if we come in a space and place once or twice, we're moving the needle, but we're not shifting the world, right? So like they have to keep those that language going. So we try to adopt as much as we can, as long as it's safe and as long as it makes sense. Yeah.
I do. I love that. I often think, like, I wish I had a different title than sex educator, because I feel like, and it's the same kind of thing, I'm sure, like what you're saying with rape, you kind of hear those words and they're such strong words that people kind of forget what encompasses all
Yeah.
around that. And they just kind of tune out as soon as you give the titles.
Yeah, there's a lot of like often in spaces we'll be asked to come in, and then people will ask immediately if we can say something to parents. Hey, can you talk to the PTA, the PTO, just to kind of give a thing. And I think there's been times where, especially during COVID, I remember we were with one, and like there was an online thing, and we like logged in, and uh, parents came on, and I think they had a preconceived idea. And then like once we start talking, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's cool. Like,
It is.
and these were people who were doing like Title IX work in colleges. They're we had worked with them previously, and it's college is a little different world. So they came in thinking something different. They're like, oh, okay, that's approachable. Yeah, yeah,
I
we're
love
not,
that.
we're not hurting anybody.
What would you say, like trying to get into the schools? How difficult or easy is that for you?
It really depends. So we get a lot of requests, and a lot of those requests are sometimes reactionary. So they had an incident in school, they're very concerned, or something has happened, and they want to make sure that it's dealt with in this sort of in what I'm going to say really reactionary kind of way.
Mm.
And then there's other places who reach out to us and they want they want work. They know that it's important. But I think the consistent barrier really is time across the board,
Mm.
because we know that in prevention and primary prevention, like you can't just do a one-off large assembly experience and then it really makes any sort of difference. It really has to be an ongoing conversation that takes place over a few weeks, maybe a few months, maybe definitely a few classes for sure. And it has to have that sort of give and take experience where we're having a conversation, hopefully with the kids, if they're able to or they're willing to. Sometimes they're not. And that really, so I think that, so some places will reach out to us really ones like, hey, you come in and just talk to everybody at one time and we'll sort of either check it off, or I don't think they mean any malice by it, but and we have to say no. We don't do that. We just don't. I refuse. I don't think it's worth my time or the students' time. And I think more often than not, that the kids will walk away with misinformation or misremembered information, and then or they think they solved something, and then there's no work there.
Right.
So I think that's a barrier, and sometimes parents can be barriers for sure, or like one administrator, like one person's just like, I don't think this belongs in our school, or so it can happen. It rarely happens, to be honest. I think often it's a time or in sort of this need to rush, and then really the capacity of the school as well, right? They're often fighting testing
Mm.
or other scheduling too. Scheduling can often be tough too, because they want to make sure that they're often trying to put us in spaces that they're really small, maybe a quick like 20-minute like homeroom or something like that, or 20 minutes sort of experience during lunch, and we know that's not enough time, right? By the time we settle in, like we're done.
Right.
So those are really the biggest barriers. I mean, for the most part, I think people want to have these conversations, mostly because they don't want to have the conversations. They don't want to do it, right?
Right.
Even school districts that have like comprehensive sex education, we're still asked to come in because often those teachers don't feel empowered or really skillful, I think, to do it. We have this conversation every day, right? So we have language, we have thought, we have thought about responses 100 times. We're used to calling childline when a student discloses randomly in third period. That's not something that terrifies us. You know,
Right.
it's something we want to make sure those kids get support and they get connected to services, but it's not something we're worried about. So we're not holding back, I think, in spaces.
So obviously, there are some very heated conversations about, how we should educate children and at what age certain topics of discussion are appropriate for kids. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think that's a very polarized topic right now. Have you found that the conversation has differed at all in the last several years, where like that has been such a huge point of conversation, not necessarily relating directly to this, but I think just the conversation about sexual violence has shifted a bit, unfortunately, in society, at least, and that's coming from myself and somebody that's a bit removed from it, right? So I'm living in England, like I see it sort of from afar, from social media and whatnot. So I am curious if it's something that have you noticed a difference in like the reception of, those conversations, or has it been pretty steady across the board?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think on the individual level, most of it is pretty steady. I think there has been absolutely some progress in students and younger students, really approaching it from an inclusionary perspective, thinking about relationships differently, thinking about who can have relationships, And I think the truth is that has been very, I think, like a positive sort of change. I think as the younger kids grow up, they especially I'm not saying it's all great, because there's still definitely some problems, but I feel like that has been true. I do think on the reverse, though, a lot of adults and media and teachers' fears and concerns can kind of get blown up occasionally. And when that happens, I think that's sort of where the disconnect or the discord occurs whenever we're trying to actually say a different message than what they accept or expect to happen. And I mean, I'll be completely honest, we're pretty open about what sexual violence is. We know sexual violence incorporates not just sort of touch behaviors, but language, as well
Mhm.
as targeting of people's gender expression or sexual identity, right? We know that's real, so that's sexual violence. So like we talk about it in real ways, and I think kids find that refreshing, and I think honestly most of the adults do too. I think it gets stuck in a few dumb places, and then um, you know, I was with a school district not too long ago, and I won't name names or anything, but you know, I had talked to some of their staff members, and they were very excited about it. And I was like, "Hey, I would really like to bring this in to talk to your kids." And she was like, "Well, that sounds great, but we're currently in the process of banning books, so we'll see if that happens. And that was just like, like off the cuff. I was like, yeah, it seems like it's probably a difficult like culture, and it wasn't really the school
Absolutely,
district. It
yeah.
was really the push of the parental sort of expression and things like that. So there's that. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I tend to
Yeah,
babble a lot, but I really don't. I
perfect.
think there's been inches in spaces, and like most change, right? I think most change kind of takes slowly. I will say there has been with recent changes, there has been some emboldenment of some more hateful expression and language. Like kids picking up terminology that they use might not even understand what it is. Like your body, my choice, things like that. That was said. And I know some educators get some pushback here and there.
I think too, one of the things that you said about sort of just discussing boundaries, like, I think even for me, when you talk about, oh, like going into, K through 12 schools and like younger kids, you kind of do get this like, oh my gosh, like, wow, like how do you have that conversation? But as you pointed out, like it is at the heart of it, it is about boundaries. Like I remember growing up, I was really close with one of my grandmothers and I was not close with my other grandmother. And I refused to hug the one that I was not close with. And my mom was adamant that, like, I would not be forced to hug someone if I did not want to. And that was when we were leaving family gatherings, and that's something that I've only recently recognized as, like, wow, like, she was so far ahead of her time in, like, respecting boundaries and respecting my boundaries and my voice, even though I was a quiet, shy kid that
Yeah,
she recognized when I was in those settings, I didn't want to be hugged all the time. Like sometimes, and I just thinking back on that, I'm like, obviously, as Jenna mentioned, so my wife is now is pregnant. We're expecting in the next several
congratulations.
weeks. So those are things that I want to make sure that I'm instilling into my child's life, and just making sure that I'm following, carrying that on. People don't realize that that is how the conversation starts with kids, is like just respecting
Yep.
boundaries.
Yeah, it's actually really important, especially to that we do teach our kids that boundaries is really connected. It doesn't boundaries don't go away, and the opportunity to say consent doesn't go away based on the person who's involved with it. Obviously, as a parent, there's going to be certain things that kids have to do and they don't want to do, and that's really centered around safety and concern and like the ability to live. But also, there's that sort of pause, right? That idea that like often we know that people who are grooming children or sexually like abusing children come from families, right? They're people they know, they're people they're trusted. And if we set up a stage where trusted adults
Mhm.
can supersede consent, then I think we set up like a a space where abuse is easily excused, or normalized, or not normalized, but it's harder to recognize. And then kids don't have the language or the skills to be like, oh, this doesn't make sense here because we've been told that my consent doesn't matter here, right? And I think that's an oversimplification of it, but I do think that starts there, and I do think there's an opportunity for parents to lay that groundwork early, and to start to think about safety in different ways than like stranger danger and things like that, because we know that strangers absolutely cause harm, but they're not the ones that often are causing
Right. That's such a I've, like, seen that whole thing morph even from having my own kids, like, from when they were really young, that became,
harm.
like, a thing then, like, started to become a thing where it was like, "Oh, you don't have to hug this person." Like, I am in a Italian family, so everybody hugs and
Yeah,
kisses.
yeah,
And I think back to when I was younger and I'm like, I wouldn't even have known what to do if I didn't hug or kiss somebody goodbye. Like, that's just what we did.
yeah,
And then I started to tell my kids that, where it was like, you don't have to. Like, you don't have to do that. And I can just remember, like, the older generations of my family, like, what are you telling them?
yeah,
That is not allowed here. So it has morphed. And now it just seems like the norm. Now it's
Yeah.
just like, you don't have to. Like, it's just, you don't have to touch somebody if you don't want to. You don't have to hold their hand. You don't have to do so
yeah,
I feel like it was at first it was like you're a soft parent or you're
mhm,
trying to allow your kid to control.
yeah,
And that's hard. I think with a lot of these things, it looks like people are letting their kids have more control. But in
Yeah.
this situation, I think it's where it's needed.
That's interesting though, because we often talk about like the idea of power and control in those spaces. And I think what's really interesting is that really hard balance that parents have to face, right? Because they also still have a responsibility to keep their children safe. And we have a program, or I haven't done it for a little bit, called Parents in the Know, that was really sort of about like, it was sort of about getting parents on, like, recognizing that parents often feel like a strong barrier to bring up when there's concerns with their kid around other people doing boundaries, and sort of bystander intervention in many ways. But there is that sort of, I've seen parents sort of take it too far, and they're willing to, like, they want to give their kids so much like autonomy, without recognizing kids don't have the skills to like understand often what a safe person is. And even if they might recognize it, they still have to, there's still that need, because we know that groomers are really good, people who are grooming children are really good at making, like, normalizing abuse, and really good at normalizing abuse for the community too. So there's still really a responsibility there, this balancing act of how do I make sure my kid has autonomy and understands consent, but also like I still have a role in protecting my child, and making sure that like adults, or people with power structure aren't manipulating to circumvent that sort of, like, where they actually don't have choice, and they're actually being harmed and they think there's choice, because often kids will think they're adults, and often kids will think that, well, I'm making choices in this matter, but they're really not. There's a power and control there. So it's a weird blend, right? And it's really a difficult dance, I think, that parents and um, caregivers have to kind of navigate. And I think most of them do pretty good. It's just, as long as it's mindful, I think that's the hardest part, is reminding yourself that I have to, you know, it's, it's teaching boundaries is work.
It is. It's very difficult. So I heard that, and I'm not sure if this falls under what you do, that there's a program starting in one of the school districts, local school districts, with, I don't know if it goes into the advocacy more than the education, but doing a more ongoing program with the students.
So, one of the things that we try to do in prevention, especially primary prevention, is having a multitude of like an ongoing program. A lot of our schools actually that we're in consistently. So we're in less schools more consistently, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
We received a grant. One of the things that I want to do is sort of work with or within a peer education structure as well. So it's really important that though my educators are younger than me, I think it's really important to hear things from adults. I really do, but it's also important to hear some of that leadership experience from children as well. Like, they shift the culture, they move their cultures and spaces, they they do that. So the charter school is really sort of an interesting space, because they have K through 8, and they're growing into a high school.
Oh,
So I'm hoping that, as we are sort of instilling programming in there, we've been in that school for probably 2 years now, and just doing some like classroom stuff, some teacher training things here and there. I think we've done a few parent stuff, but really my hope is that what I want to do over the 5-year grant is just keep growing that, to really have a saturation of community, right? The idea that most people in that space have heard this messaging, most people have thought about this message, maybe students are saying this messaging, they're supporting it in different ways. And as we grow into high school, we also know that, like, giving them peer education and leadership skills is a resiliency building factor against violence. We know, so there's I think, a lot of benefit to having that ongoing saturation of not just students, but also teachers and parents and staff. And one of the things I like to do the most is actually talk to educators. Like, one of my favorite things to do, as in my role, is talk to educator. I was an English teacher for many years before I moved over into this space, and I recognize there was absolutely times in my tenure as a teacher that I missed things, that I responded in an appropriate way, and I have no shame saying that. I have no shame saying. I mean, I do have shame, but I understand now. I have no problem saying, like, hey, like, they're like, you don't have the skill set often when you come out of teacher school or wherever you're at, to really think about it from a multiple facets standpoint. And often we lump often teachers, myself included, lump behavior together instead of recognizing that somebody might be experiencing um, a power imbalance or be a victim in this moment, and that approach and that response has to be different. We have to think about it differently, and we have to make sure we're not like retaliating against victims by mistake or normalizing behavior or just sort of what I call status quoing it, like everybody calm down in the back. We got to get back to like you know
Right.
Romeo and Juliet or whatever the heck we're teaching at the time, right? Which is a problematic book in itself, but
Right. Right. Exactly. I do think it starts exactly what you're talking about, starting with the higher ups, the educators, the
yeah,
caseworkers, and obviously a lot do know, but
yeah.
fortunately a lot coming out of school and they just kind of throw them in there.
Yeah, and also, like, I think one of the big reasons it actually is, I think it's supportive of victims and too, right? The idea that if I go into a school and I say all this stuff and I say, and the kids are like, oh, like, well, I should say something when I see something, or I should, if I see some like sexual harassment happening, I should tell somebody, and they go and they tell somebody and that's not a safe person to tell and they don't have a good response, or they victim blame that person, then what we get is a student then who's like, well, why should I say anything? And then that culture keeps going. We were in a school many years ago. This is probably I'm maybe 6 years ago, if I remember. It was a while, and the school was having trouble with what they had deemed slap butt Thursday, where like
I've
they'd
heard
run
about
around. Yeah. So it's silly, it's kid stuff, but it's also like not kid stuff in many ways, right? And we witnessed it, right? In this fact, there was, you know, one of the teachers called the girl aside and she's like, well, why do you let them do that to you? And what I heard right there was like, why are you blaming that victim for something that just occurred to
the
them? Something just hit them running through the hallway. Like so even they don't have the language, and they're really stuck often in that sort of what I think is sort of like a victim blaming mindset, where they just assume that somebody, because the way they dress, or because how they talk, because who they are, that somehow that is also their fault and they can't get out of it. I think that really, unfortunately, is a cultural problem we have. Like we wanna blame people for the things that happen to them instead of recognizing that things sometimes happen to people and it's not their fault. Um, correlation doesn't equal causation in spaces, and I think there's also this problem that it's easier if we just blame people, instead of finding root causes, like, oh, it must have been their fault. I mean, I've been in spaces where teachers were like overly sexualizing children and like, and is blaming them for like, well, they wear that because they want to be looked at. I'm like, that's a child you're talking about. Just, you should remember that. Like, don't adultify, don't adultify children,
right.
um, so that's a problem. Those are, I don't know what the question was, but that's, like,
No, and I'm glad you actually, I thought that to myself, like, I don't even remember what I said, but I'm glad you actually talked about that.
one of the things I think is super important is we can't restrict these conversations to sexual violence crisis centers.
Right.
Like, people should be leading them and having these conversations all over the place. And so I think I'm always so honored and moved by like people who aren't getting paid to do this work and really picking it up and moving with it. I've been doing this for almost 8 years now and extremely passionate. I mean, literally, this work has changed the way I think about my life,
Right.
which is fantastic, right? Um, but at the same time, like, if we just do this, then nothing will get done. Like, it has to be like communities have to like adopt this and think about this in certain ways, and without like conversations like this and the things you're doing is really that, without people putting that forward, like, we're just you know what is it, like echoing into the sound box, or talking to our
Right.
into our cheer team or whatever. So
Can I
No,
yeah,
ask what made you go into this profession?
I was teaching English in Erie Public. My wife at the time was going to school up there. Um, and when she graduated and she got a residency down here, we moved back, right? And I couldn't find a teaching job. I just couldn't. Like, it was back in like, it was like, I don't know, 20 years now at the point in time.
right.
or maybe 15 years, I can't remember. But I couldn't find a teaching job. And I slotted myself into nonprofit work. So I'd work with students, sort of bridging the gap of services and bridging, sort of connecting to them. And the social worker at the time asked me to reach out to an organization called Pittsburgh Action Against Rape. And an educator came in named Gail Brown, who's on my team actually. She's been here for like 20 some years. She came in and she did a presentation on sexual harassment. And it was like one of those sort of pivotal moments where I kind of like shifted. And I said, you know what, we should really think about this in a real way. So I was working with students at the time, and we were working in like a resource sort of center. And so students who were accused or had some sort of boundary violation behavior or sexual harassment behavior, they came to me and I talked to them about it really in a really sort of like casual kind of like, hey, boundary kind of way, like in a mentory kind of way. And I thought it was so important and critical, and I really liked it. And it seemed like a really important work, and it just made like literally like it's so weird how like it shifted the way I think about like a lot of things in my life, and like my friend groups and like how they talked and how I talked and what was normalized and what was normalized. And then like a position opened up here, and I shifted over, and then the rest is history. Like, and no matter where I go, like if for some reason, we move or we whatever, like I think this work will have in many ways changed who I am at my core and my soul. Like I could never go back. Like I could never be somebody different, which I think is impactful and powerful in a weird way.
Yeah.
And I hope that like sometimes we have conversations with people and a similar thing happens, right? That people say, "Oh, huh, I didn't really thought about it that way," and maybe it's just shifting one person at a time until people change. I also feel like in many ways this job has changed my sense of humor, like what I've liked and what I don't like, and like I can see things that I really used to enjoy sort of witty like dark kind of comedy. And though I can still see like the craft and the wit in it, I'm like, oh, that's funny, but also it's harmful, so it's not funny.
Whenever you go through something or you help somebody through something, I automatically shift to that. Like that's where my mind goes, and I'm like, well, there goes the comedy because it's no longer funny at all to me.
So one of the things we do is we have a program that works with like restaurants and bars and service industry experiences, and early on, like some of the conversation we have really is around like back of the kitchen humor, right? And how often humor is used as a setup or a trope or excuse or whatever to say things that push boundaries and make the workplace an unsafe place. Um, so we never know, and I want to be completely honest and say truthful and say two friends can have a conversation that is both consensual and they like it. It might be like, weird and problematic in other spaces, but they can have it and that's fine. Like we're not saying you can't have these conversations, you can't like find that stuff funny, but when it's in a public space and there's other people who have to go there, what it becomes is a hostile work environment. I had a friend who got in trouble. He's like, he was talking about a competitor and he's like, oh, they're really raping us. And he's like, I don't understand why I got in trouble. I said, well, like first off, here's why that's problematic. And B, like, I mean, it's also like be a little smarter. You can have better language than that. Like,
The amount of times I've heard that is actually crazy. And it literally is like, as a sexual assault survivor, it is the most like upsetting thing that somebody can say. And I just kind of have to like remove myself with some people because sometimes the education piece doesn't come into play at that moment with me. It's more of the like protecting
yeah,
my,
yeah.
my mental health. But that is said so often. I'm glad you brought that up because
Mhm.
maybe everybody will hear this and recognize that that is never an appropriate thing to say.
I think it's really interesting how like the media and how like people sort of gravitate to experiences and then joke about things. A little bit ago, I'm sure you remember like the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard sort of trial that occurred, and really so much like so many like memes and like jokes and songs that came out of that. And though like I have no idea, but all I saw as a victim service person was like like when we keep joking about people's experience of violence, there's people in the world who recognize that, who see that, and then it makes them less safe for them, right? The world becomes less safe for them, or you become less safe for them, and you don't might even recognize it. You're just like jumping on the trend and making like jokes about somebody's violence, and because they're like celebrities, they don't seem real. But to that person, to the people who experience violence, they internalize that and they recognize you're no longer a safe person. So why should I tell you when these things occur in my life, or why should I be that person? Or like why it's important to have a good response whenever like somebody responds to you and like, hey, I've been sexually harassed, like not normalizing that or not like blowing it off like, oh, that just happens here, get used to it. um you know that's something that we can't do, because then that person thinks like, oh, okay, well then my experience is normalized, and I you know when I came forward and said something once, somebody didn't believe me, or I didn't, so they're less likely to say something again.
So tell me, if someone in the local area
Mhm.
wants to reach out to PAR to have them come into the school or maybe a work environment, what's the best way to do that?
So they can do it really good in two different ways. We have on our website, they have, not only do we have a list of all of our, this is par.net, www.par.net, PAAR.net. We have a list of all our trainings and like workshops, so they can see what they like, what makes sense. There's an info tab they can go on and just general contact, or they can email me. I love talking about people. I love talking about this, obviously, and talking to people. They can email me directly at willem@par.com, and like, I would love to have a conversation with them, and see how we can fit their needs. One of the things we do is we really, I find value in tailoring things to people's spaces and places.
What about in different areas? Like, what would you advise somebody to do that's not in the Pittsburgh area?
If they are in the Pennsylvania area, um, there is, chances are there's local resources in most counties, right? But really, also if they go on to like Rain or NSVRC, and they sort of look to see after those spaces and call them, they can look to see what's local in their area. One of the things that PCAR, which is the Pennsylvania Coalition to Advance Respect, they changed their name recently, can do too. So if they call them, they can kind of see what's locally in their area. Um, and I think it's real that there's often not going to be, like, there might not be services in certain areas, and you might not be. So I think sometimes that if reaching out to like-minded people to have like parent groups and having like and having like community conversations can move that needle too.
We always like to end on a glimmer, which is the opposite of a trigger. So something that, glimmerizes us, and that we, that made what is that not, are we not, Jenna, what was that face?
I'm still thinking. I'm just trying to
Oh,
think of
you have
mine.
not thought. Well, for
I know
reference,
you
I
did.
literally texted Jenna earlier today and said, just a reminder, you need to come up with 2 glimmers today. And still she has 0.
But I already got something.
Would you
Mine,
like to
I
go,
will
Jen?
tell first because it's so good.
Go on.
I had the most amazing ginger scone today, like unreal. And it don't even make the best. It actually made my life. I don't know. Something about like having something that like actually tastes really, really good when you're putting those calories in and you're like, this was worth every single calorie. It was that ginger scone. It was amazing at Anthos if anybody wants to go.
My glimmer is more sort of like along the lines of the conversation that we just had, because we don't know if we're having a girl or a boy. So this has been a really good reminder of like what those boundary conversations are going to look like, for one versus the other, unfortunately, because it is going to be a different conversation depending on what gender we have, most likely. So this is a really good conversation point for my wife and I to have now, and not when our child is 16 years old and on the wrong side of history. I think this has been like a very eye-opening conversation about just like where you start with those topics, right? So thank you very much.
Yeah. Am I
Oh,
supposed
yes, it's all
It's
you.
your turn.
Okay.
Hard to top those, especially the ginger scone.
I do want to sort of go along the same sort of track. The idea that sort of within the conversation, I had the immense pleasure of giving a tour to a group of educators who are working at a local campus, and sort of her project safe or safe students are doing such immense work in the community, in their community. And they came, and having come, I gave them a tour of the building and talked about it, and having really, and I just have to say, like, the amount of hope I had that I think often we see spaces and places, and we think that everybody out there is dangerous and everybody out there is buying into garbage thought, like to see like so many youth like buying into like safety is just hopeful, and it touches my heart, and I'm so grateful for them. So yeah.
And once again, I have brought the most exciting glimmer while the two of you just talked about something very amazing and deep. I have just thrown out the scone.
Congratulations on your ginger scone. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. I know that was
If you or someone you know has experienced a sexual violence, RAINN.org is a nationwide 24/7 support. You can also reach out to Genna confidentially at GennaMarieLifeCoach@gmail.com. GennaMarieLifeCoach@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Life and Death Podcast. Please be sure to leave us a review and comment to let us know what you thought of the episode. And don't forget to follow us so you never miss an update. You can email us at lifeanddeathpodcast@gmail.com. You'll find Genna on Instagram under the handle Genna Marie Life Coaching, and I, Noelle, can be found at Noelle E. Carlin.
Living death through ups and downs, finding smiles beyond the frowns. Stay with us, we'll light the way. See you next time, bright and gay.